So Dave Roberts has this piece, and we're going to put a link to it. There's a ballot initiative, Initiative 732 in Washington State. Washington State, one of the more progressive states in the country, certainly when it comes to the environment. It's a carbon tax, and it would be the first carbon tax in the U.S., the biggest in North America, and one of the most ambitious in the world. Canada, I believe, has one, or maybe local ones. What do they call states? Provinces. So this is what it would do. It would impose a tax on carbon emissions, starting at $15 per ton in 2017, rising to $25 per ton in 2018, and then rising every year thereafter at 3.5% plus inflation. Tops out at $100 a ton in 2016 dollars. The tax would reach citizens in the form of a gas tax and a tax collected by electric utilities. It would then reduce the state sales tax by 1 percentage point. It would fund the working family's tax rebate, which bumps up, essentially, it supplements the federal earned income tax credit. And then it would eliminate the business and occupation tax on manufacturing. So the idea is this would be revenue neutral. I'm going to put aside whether or not the analysis of whether it's actually going to be revenue neutral aside for a moment. Conceptually, the idea is revenue neutral. The tax cuts are in there to sort of win conservatives over. The revenue neutrality is there to win conservatives over. The notion of where the tax cuts are is supposed to help with liberal support because a sales tax is very regressive, tends to be regressive. In other words, if I'm making $15,000 a year, and I got to pay sales tax on stuff that everybody has to buy, that's a greater percentage of my income than it is if I'm making $150,000 a year. It would eliminate the business and occupation tax on manufacturing so as to offset the costs of the program to them or to mitigate the costs of the program so you don't have manufacturing fleeing from the state. It's Carbon Washington, Carbon WA, is the group that put it on the ballot. And essentially written by a climate economist. Now, here's the weird part. Liberal groups in Washington State, Labor, Democratic Party, whatnot, they're against it. And they call it, I think it's the Alliance for Jobs and Clean Energy, broadly speaking. And they believe that Carbon Washington's claims are misleading, that its policy is fatally incomplete and insufficient. And they think it would set back climate progress. And broadly speaking, it comes down to the idea that this sets a model. It supplants other efforts to get a carbon tax whose proceeds, rather than being revenue neutral, could actually promote clean energy and move the ball forward in terms of changing technologies. That it would help those communities, because we all know, right, who suffers first in terms of the impact of any disaster, natural or others. It's generally low-income people. You could say that broadly across the world. We just talked about with the Kigali Accords, and you could say that about within the context of cities. And there's no funding to help those people who are most affected by climate change. And it gets a lot more complicated and sophisticated than I'm just describing. I'm just doing very broad. There's some people whose perspective it is like there's just, hurt egos and feelings. And there's others that like, look, we're setting a template. Because, any carbon reduction anywhere is worth it the same amount anywhere else. But when a template is formed, then it starts to replicate itself across the country. And if you're going to start in a place like Washington State, you may want to wait a year or two because of the implications of what it's actually going to do to the climate in Washington state is less than what it would do if that becomes a template and it is brought and it is used across the country. So it's a fascinating piece. Maybe we'll have Dave Roberts on. See. He's always tough to book.
Okay.
Because he's on the West Coast.
Okay.
And I know he's got to take his kids to school, I think.
There was a lot of controversy, I think, because in the Clinton administration, I think Al Gore had some type of modest sort of gas tax that he was wanted to push through in 1993. And if I know the political history correctly, it was the opposition to that was who you'd expect, carbon companies and senators and congresspeople that represented those interests, but also some of the more kind of populist advisors were like, we're already sort of bailing on so many of our middle class commitments, and we're doing NAFTA, and now you're just basically asking more people to pay more taxes on basic energy consumption. So it's always been a potential conflict.
Well, this
I know this is
tax
different.
offsets it.
No, I know it offsets. That one didn't have an offset, but it set the template, I guess.
Right. When you look back at that time, then maybe it would be a good template for that time. But who knows? And it's an interesting piece. I just wanted to flag it for people. I know. Subscribe.